Police beat up old woman, but Messi rushes to save her. The evening air was cool, and the streetlights had already begun to flicker on. People hurried home after a long day, too caught up in their own worries to pay attention to the world around them. Cars moved lazily along the road, silhouettes of cafe patrons visible behind glass windows, sipping their coffee. The city hummed with its usual life. Maria Ivanovna, an elderly woman with kind but weary eyes, walked slowly down a narrow sidewalk, leaning on her old cane. In her other hand she carried a small grocery bag, just a loaf of bread, some milk and a few apples. It was all she could afford on her modest pension. Her legs ached after a long day, but she had grown used to it, used to enduring. Life had never been easy, but she had always managed to push through. She turned the corner, making her way toward the bus stop, when the sharp screech of tires cut through the evening air. A police car braked abruptly in front of her, stopping just inches from where she stood. The doors swung open and two uniformed officers stepped out. One was tall, broad-shouldered, with rough features and a cold, calculating gaze. The other was younger, thinner, with a smirk that hinted at arrogance. "Hey, old lady," the younger officer called out, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "What are you doing out here?" Maria Ivanovna stopped, blinking in confusion. "I'm going home," she said calmly. "Is something wrong, officers?" The taller officer took a step forward, eyeing her with mild amusement. "We got a report about a pickpocket in this area," he said slowly as if savoring his own words. "And you matched the description." Maria Ivanovna furrowed her brows, gripping her cane a little tighter. "Are you joking? I just left the grocery store." "Oh yeah." The officer smirked. "Let's see your bag." She hesitated, her face growing pale. "But I haven't stolen anything." "You're wasting our time, Granny," the younger officer's tone hardened. "We won't ask twice." Maria Ivanovna hesitated for a brief moment before reluctantly extending her bag toward them. The officer didn't wait. He yanked it from her hands, shaking it upside down. The groceries tumbled onto the cold pavement. The milk bottle hit the ground and shattered, a small river of white liquid spreading across the concrete. "Look at this," the younger officer sneered, kicking an apple away. "A loaf of bread, apples, and you really expect us to believe you?" Maria Ivanovna felt her throat tighten. She fought back tears, forcing herself to remain composed. "I have a receipt," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh, a receipt," the officer laughed. "How convenient." Then, before she could react, he grabbed her by the shoulder and shoved her backward. She couldn't catch herself in time. Her legs buckled and she collapsed onto the hard pavement, pain shooting through her side. Her old cane clattered beside her. Her breath came in short gasps as she tried to regain control. "Maybe now you'll tell us the truth?" The older officer's voice loomed over her. She struggled to push herself up, but her hands shook too much. "I didn't do anything." A small crowd had started to form. Passers-by had stopped to watch, some frozen in place, others raising their phones to record. But no one stepped forward. The taller officer lifted his boot and pressed it down onto her cane, snapping it in two. Maria Ivanovna flinched. "Why?" she barely managed to whisper. "To remind you of your place," the officer smirked. Someone in the crowd muttered something, a few murmurs of disapproval rippling through the onlookers. But no one moved. Then a sudden sound broke the tense silence, the screech of tires. A black SUV came to a halt just a few meters away. The doors opened and a figure stepped onto the street. He moved with a graceful yet powerful stride, dressed simply in a dark sports jacket. The crowd collectively gasped in recognition. Lionel Messi. The police officers exchanged quick glances. For the first time, hesitation flickered across their faces. Messi stepped forward, his expression unreadable. His eyes, however, were sharp, assessing, filled with a quiet intensity. "What's going on here?" His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. The older officer stiffened. "This doesn't concern you," he said, crossing his arms. "We're just doing our job." Messi's gaze flicked downward, landing on Maria Ivanovna. She was still struggling to catch her breath, her frail frame trembling. "Really?" His voice dropped, dangerously quiet. "This is what you call your job?" The crowd held their breath. Some had already begun live streaming. Footage of the incident was already circulating online, but now the world's most famous footballer stood in the center of it. The older officer shifted uncomfortably, sweat beginning to bead at his temple. "This woman has legal issues," he tried to argue, but the confidence in his voice had waned. Messi didn't look away. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a single tap, he turned on the camera and pointed it at the officers. "Say that again," he said. Silence. Maria Ivanovna sucked in a shaky breath, looking up at her unexpected protector. A faint flicker of hope glimmered in her tired eyes. The crowd remained still. The game had just begun. The two officers stood frozen, their eyes locked on Messi's phone screen as it recorded their every move. The tension in the air was suffocating. The younger officer, Ricci, shifted uneasily, glancing toward his partner as if waiting for a signal. Bruno, the older one, clenched his jaw, clearly debating his next move. Messi didn't waver. His grip on the phone was steady, his expression unreadable. The silence dragged on for what felt like an eternity, and the gathered crowd watched with bated breath. "Go on," Messi said coolly, his voice eerily calm. "Say what you just said." Bruno licked his lips, scanning the faces in the crowd. Too many people. Too many cameras. There was no easy way out of this. His authority, his control, it was slipping through his fingers. Ricci took a step back. "This is ridiculous. We don't have to explain ourselves to some. To some what?" Messi interrupted sharply. Ricci clamped his mouth shut. Bruno exhaled through his nose, trying to regain control of the situation. "Look, Mr. Messi," he said, forcing a patronizing smile, "you don't understand how these things work. We got a report about a suspect in this area and This woman is nearly 70 years old," Messi cut in, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "And you're telling me she fits the description of a criminal?" Bruno hesitated. Messi took a slow step forward, his camera still rolling. "What did she do? Carry a bag of groceries too suspiciously? Walk too slowly?" His eyes bore into the officers. "Or is it just because you thought no one would stop you?" Ricci shifted again. "This is harassment," he muttered under his breath. Messi let out a breathy chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "Harassment?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. He pointed at Maria, who was still struggling to sit up. "You threw an old woman onto the ground, broke her cane, humiliated her in front of dozens of people, and now you're calling this harassment?" Maria Ivanovna coughed softly, her breathing uneven. Messi's focus immediately shifted back to her, his stern expression softening just slightly. He crouched beside her, lowering his phone for a moment. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Maria swallowed hard. My wrist," she murmured. Her voice was barely a whisper. Messi turned toward the crowd. "Someone call an ambulance." Several people scrambled to do just that, fumbling with their phones. A few murmured to each other, eyes darting between Messi and the police, as if trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. Bruno had had enough. He grabbed his radio and spoke into it, though his voice was lower now, less sure of himself. "We have a situation. Requesting backup." Messi tilted his head, studying him. "Backup?" he echoed. "You need backup to handle an old woman and a footballer?" Bruno ignored him. He turned to Ricci. "Let's go. We'll let the station deal with this." Messi's eyes narrowed. "No," he said, standing up to block their path. Ricci scoffed. "You can't stop us." Messi lifted his phone again, making sure it was aimed directly at their faces. "You can try to leave," he said coolly, "but I promise you if you do, by morning your faces will be on every screen in the world." The officers exchanged nervous glances. Bruno clenched his fists. "You think you can tell us how to do our job?" Messi stepped forward, his posture unwavering. "I think you stopped doing your job the moment you decided power meant you could treat people however you wanted." The sirens in the distance grew louder. The officers stiffened. Within seconds, another police car pulled up. The doors opened and a senior officer stepped out, his gaze immediately scanning the scene. His eyes landed on Messi first, then Maria, then the dozens of phones recording every move. His face paled slightly. "Bruno," the senior officer said, voice tense. "What the hell is going on here?" Bruno hesitated. "Sir, we were..." The senior officer held up a hand, silencing him. Then he turned to Messi. "Mr. Messi, I apologize for whatever has happened here," he said quickly, his voice suddenly professional. "We'll get this sorted out." Messi didn't lower his phone. "You'll sort it out?" His tone was biting. "That's not enough." The senior officer swallowed. He could feel the weight of every recording device pointed at him. "Bruno." "Ricci." His voice was clipped. "Hand over your badges." Ricci's mouth fell open. "Wait, what?" Bruno stepped forward, his face red with fury. "You can't be serious." The senior officer's expression darkened. "Now." Bruno stood frozen for a long moment, as if debating whether to argue. But one glance at Messi's phone, at the crowd around them, at the sheer scope of the disaster they had created, and he knew he had no way out. With a jerky movement, he pulled off his badge and tossed it onto the hood of the patrol car. Richie hesitated, then did the same, though his jaw was clenched tight. The crowd erupted into murmurs. Messi finally lowered his phone. The senior officer exhaled. "An ambulance is on the way, ma'am," he said to Maria. "I deeply regret what happened." Messi turned back to her, kneeling beside her again. "It's over," he said softly. She blinked up at him, exhaustion evident in her features. "Thank you." He smiled, though it was small and sad. "You don't have to thank me." The distant hum of news helicopters began to echo above. The world was watching now. Messi exhaled and turned back to the officers. "Next time," he said, voice calm but firm, "think before you act." And with that, he turned his attention back to Maria, ready to make sure she got the help she needed. Because this wasn't just about one night. This was about making sure it never happened again. The crowd stood frozen, watching as the officers, humiliated and stunned, remained still before their commanding officer. Bruno and Richie's faces were tense, their jaws clenched. All their arrogance, all the power they had wielded so freely, had crumbled into dust under the unrelenting gaze of dozens of cameras. Maria Ivanovna breathed heavily, feeling the fear inside her slowly give way to relief. Her trembling fingers clutched a broken piece of her old cane, as if holding onto it could bring back even a fraction of her confidence. She lifted her gaze and met Messi's eyes once again. "Is it really over?" Her voice was weak, barely a whisper. Messi nodded, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Yes. They can't hurt you now." She swallowed hard, tears welling up in her eyes. Meanwhile, the senior officer straightened his posture, his voice sharp but lacking the authority it once held. "Bruno, Ricci, report to the station immediately. We'll deal with this later. This is unfair." Ricci blurted, his face flushing red with anger. "We didn't do anything wrong. You beat an elderly woman, and now you're saying you didn't do anything?" Messi's eyes narrowed, his voice icy. "Dozens of people witnessed your actions." Bruno clenched his fists but said nothing. He knew arguing now was pointless. The crowd was murmuring louder now, discussing everything that had just happened. Some were still filming, others were already calling news stations. Messi could only imagine the headlines that would appear by morning. Suddenly, the distant sound of sirens pierced the night. An ambulance approached the curb and paramedics quickly stepped out, carrying a stretcher. "She may have a wrist sprain and a bruised knee," one of the medics said calmly. "We'll take her to the hospital for further examination." "I'm going with her," Messi said without hesitation. Maria Ivanovna opened her mouth to protest, but when she saw the firm determination in his eyes, she simply nodded. "Thank you." The paramedics carefully lifted her onto the stretcher and carried her into the ambulance. One of them turned to Messi. "Are you a relative?" "No," Messi said, stepping into the vehicle without waiting for permission. "But I'm not leaving her alone." The paramedic hesitated for a moment, then nodded, motioning for him to sit. As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens blared once more, the crowd watched them disappear into the night, realizing they had just witnessed something historic. Inside the ambulance, everything was quieter. Maria Ivanovna lay on the stretcher, her breathing becoming steadier. "How did you happen to be there?" she suddenly asked, her voice hoarse but filled with genuine curiosity. Messi smirked slightly. "Coincidence. I was just passing by." Maria let out a dry chuckle. "In all my years, I've never had such coincidences. Sometimes the universe puts you where you need to be," he shrugged. She nodded, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "People are afraid to interfere. I saw their faces. They didn't want to look, but they couldn't turn away either." Messi pressed his lips together, staring out the window. "It's not just fear. It's indifference. They think that if something doesn't concern them personally, it's not their problem." Maria closed her eyes, her fingers trembling slightly. "But it is, isn't it?" Messi looked at her, his expression softening. "Yes, it is." The ambulance slowed as it reached the hospital. The doors opened and suddenly flashing lights flooded the space. Reporters were already there, their voices overlapping as they shouted questions. "Messi, what happened? What's the scandal with the police? Are you going to press charges against these officers? How did you get involved in this?" Messi exhaled. He knew he couldn't avoid the press. Stepping out of the ambulance, he walked forward, right into the center of the crowd of journalists. "I'll say one thing." His voice was loud and firm. "Silence. I'm not a hero. I just did what anyone should do. But the real question is, why didn't any of you?" The reporters exchanged uneasy glances. Tonight, a woman who did nothing wrong was beaten. She could have been left there alone if I hadn't stopped. If I had decided it was not my problem, just like hundreds of people do every day. He looked around at the sea of cameras. But this concerns everyone. It doesn't matter if you're famous or just an ordinary person. If you see injustice, stop it. The reporters erupted with more questions, their cameras flashing as they captured every second. News sites were already flooding with updates. Messi turned and walked into the hospital. Inside it was calmer. Maria Ivanovna was already lying in a hospital bed, as doctors examined her wrist. Nothing serious, the doctor said. But she needs to rest. Messi nodded. Maria looked at him. I thought this night would never end. It's over, he reassured her. She gave him a small, sad smile. But a new one has begun. He nodded. Yes. Now the world has to decide what happens next. Maria glanced at the TV in the corner of the hospital room. The news was already broadcasting the incident, looping clips of the officers attacking her, the moment Messi arrived, the police being ordered to hand over their badges. You did something great, she said softly. Messi looked at her and shook his head. I did what anyone should. Maria gripped the blanket tightly. If only the world thought that way. He pulled up a chair beside her bed. Maybe one day it will. She smiled. For the first time that night she felt at peace.